Welcome. Tonight we are going down to where the ships are. Not to a harbor, not to a museum, not to any of the places where we keep the things we have built and lost and tried to remember. We are going somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and cold and very, very still. Somewhere that is not a graveyard exactly, although ships have died there. Somewhere that is not a museum, although it preserves things that nothing else could preserve. We are going to the floor of the ocean, where the wrecks lie in the dark, and we are going to watch what the ocean does to them. Not quickly, not with urgency. We are going the way the deep water moves, slowly, in currents so faint they take centuries to complete a single circuit, in the patient, unhurried manner of a world that has been doing this for longer than ships have existed. Find your comfortable position now. Let whatever is supporting you take your full weight. Let your hands rest wherever they fall. Let your jaw unclench and your shoulders release, and the small muscles around your eyes soften. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. The ocean has been receiving things for 4 billion years. It is very good at holding what we give it. And tonight, for a little while, we are going to go down and see what it has done with what we left behind. The first thing to understand about a shipwreck is that it is not an ending. It feels like an ending. The sound of a hull striking the ocean floor after a fall of 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers, the vast, slow cloud of sediment that billows outward in every direction when something the size of a building arrives at speed on the soft mud of the abyssal plain. The silence that follows as the sediment settles and the wreck sits motionless in the dark for the first time since it was built. It feels, if you could witness it, like a conclusion, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. But it is not. It is something closer to the opposite. The moment a ship reaches the bottom of the ocean is the moment it begins a second life. A longer life in many ways than the first. A stranger one, certainly. A life governed not by the plans of shipbuilders or the ambitions of captains or the destinations marked on navigational charts, but by the slow, indifferent, extraordinary logic of the deep sea itself. The ocean does not know what a ship is. It does not recognize steel or iron or wood or the particular alloys used in propeller shafts and anchor chains and boiler fittings. It knows only chemistry and pressure and the slow cycling of nutrients through an ecosystem that has been running on scarcity for hundreds of millions of years. To the deep ocean, a shipwreck is simply an event, a sudden and enormous delivery of material to a place that rarely receives anything at all except the slow drizzle of marine snow from far above. And the ocean receives this delivery the way it receives everything, patiently, thoroughly, and without sentiment. We begin with what happens in the first few hours. When a ship sinks, it does not fall straight down. It falls in pieces, or it falls whole, depending on the violence of the sinking. But even when it falls whole, it does not fall cleanly. It rolls, it tips, it sheds objects from its decks as it descends. Crockery and books and shoes and lifebelts, and all the accumulated contents of human occupation, scattering outward and downward through the water column in a slow, expanding constellation of debris. If the ship is large, the descent can take anywhere from 20 minutes to a few hours, depending on depth. During this descent, the ship passes through every zone of the ocean in sequence. The warm surface waters, where the first opportunistic scavengers may approach, and then retreat as the wreck becomes too large and too strange to investigate comfortably. The twilight zone, where the light fades and the water cools, and the creatures become stranger and more specialized. The midnight zone, where the lights of bioluminescent organisms provide the only illumination and the pressure has already climbed to levels that would crush an unprotected human being. And then the abyssal zone, where the wreck finally comes to rest on the sediment that has been accumulating on the ocean floor for millions of years. The landing changes the ocean floor in ways that take decades to fully develop, but the immediate effects are dramatic. The impact compresses the sediment and creates a shallow depression. The displacement of water sends a pressure wave outward through the deep water. The wreck itself, still warm from the life it contained, from the heat of engines and human bodies and friction, begins to release that warmth into the surrounding water. A thermal signature so faint it is almost unmeasurable but detectable to the specialized chemical and thermal receptors of the organisms that live on the abyssal plane. Within hours, the first colonizers are already arriving. These first arrivals are not the bacteria, although the bacteria will come soon enough. They are the mobile scavengers of the deep, the amphipods and isopods and small crustaceans that navigate the abyssal plain by detecting chemical gradients in the water. If the wreck contains organic material, food stores, timber, the remains of passengers or crew, those attract scavengers with a speed and efficiency that seems impossible given the distances involved in the deep ocean. The chemical plume from a food source on the abyssal floor can travel for kilometers in the slow, deep currents, and the organisms that have evolved to detect it have been doing so for millions of years. They are very good at finding things that have died in the dark. But the wreck itself, the steel and iron and wood and glass and rubber and all the other materials of human construction, those attract something different, something slower, something that will ultimately be far more consequential. The bacteria find the wreck within days. Not all bacteria, not just any bacteria, specific strains, highly specialized, that have evolved over geological timescales to extract energy from the oxidation of iron and steel and other metals in the particular chemical environment of the deep sea. These organisms are called iron-oxidizing bacteria, and they are among the most remarkable living things on Earth, not because they are large or complex or in any way dramatic in their appearance, but because of what they can do with a material that most of the living world finds completely useless. Iron metal, the structural fabric of human civilization for 2 centuries of industrialized shipbuilding. These bacteria eat it. The process they use is called chemolithotrophy, which means, in essence, extracting energy from rocks and minerals rather than from organic carbon or sunlight. The bacteria oxidize the iron in the steel, stripping electrons from iron atoms and using the energy released by this electron transfer to power their metabolism and fix carbon dioxide into organic compounds. They do not eat the ship in any conventional sense. They corrode it. They dissolve it, atom by atom, at a rate that would seem comically slow by any human timescale. But that is, when accumulated over decades and centuries, devastating to the structural integrity of even the most massive steel construction. The products of this bacterial metabolism are what make a shipwreck look the way it looks in every photograph you have ever seen of a deep wreck. The orange and red and brown formations that drape themselves over every surface, that hang from railings and portholes in long icicle-like formations, that transform the clean geometric lines of a ship's hull into something organic and strange and beautiful. These formations are called rusticles. The word was coined by oceanographer Robert Ballard when he first photographed the Titanic in 1985, and it describes perfectly what they are. Not quite rust, not quite icicles, but something in between. Hollow tubes of iron oxide and bacterial byproducts, sometimes several centimeters in diameter and several meters long, that form wherever the bacteria are most active and where water currents carry the chemical products of their metabolism downward in slow drips. They are, in a very real sense, the living bodies of a bacterial community. They are alive, they grow, they extend themselves downward through the dark water, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, following the chemistry and the gravity and the slow logic of a metabolism that does not need sunlight or warmth or any of the things that most life requires. The Titanic is the most studied shipwreck in the world, and it is the best illustration of what the ocean does to a ship over the course of a century. The ship sank on the 14th of April 1912 in the North Atlantic at approximately 41 degrees north latitude and 49 degrees west longitude. It struck an iceberg at 11:40 in the evening and sank at 2:20 in the morning, carrying more than 1,500 people into water so cold that hypothermia would have incapacitated a healthy adult within 15 to 30 minutes of immersion. The ship split in two as it sank, the bow section and the stern section separating somewhere near the surface and falling independently, landing roughly 600 meters apart on the floor of the Atlantic at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters. Robert Ballard and his team found the wreck in September of 1985, 73 years after it sank, using a remotely operated vehicle that was dragging a camera sled along the ocean floor in a systematic search pattern. The first image that confirmed the discovery was a boiler, one of the Titanic's 29 massive coal-fired boilers lying on the sediment, surrounded by a debris field that stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction. The discovery was extraordinary, but it was what Ballard's team found when they actually reached and photographed the ship itself that changed our understanding of what happens to a wreck over time. The bow section of the Titanic sits upright on the ocean floor, its prow still pointing forward, as if the ship is still underway, still on its way somewhere, still moving through a destination it never reached. The first photographs showed a ship that was recognizable, that retained the essential geometry of the object it had been. The portholes were intact in places, the anchor chains still hung in their hawse pipes. The railing that people had clutched as the ship tilted beneath them was still in place along the foredeck. And covering everything, draping every surface in long hanging curtains of orange and red and brown, were the rusticles. When Ballard returned to the Titanic in 1986, he collected samples of the rusticles and brought them to the surface for analysis. What researchers found inside those samples was a complex microbial community unlike anything that had been described before. Not just iron-oxidizing bacteria, but dozens of different species of bacteria and archaea, all of them contributing different functions to the shared task of breaking down the ship. Some oxidized iron, some reduced sulfate, drawing energy from the sulfur compounds in the steel. Some processed the organic material in the surrounding sediment, enriched by the slow decomposition of the organic matter that had gone down with the ship. Some consumed the metabolic products of their neighbors. It was a food web, a complete ecosystem, contained within the rusticle itself, operating in the dark at the bottom of the North Atlantic, entirely self-sufficient, entirely dependent on the chemistry of the ship it was consuming. Researchers who have studied the Titanic over the past 40 years have watched this process in real time. The wreck is measurably smaller than it was when Ballard first photographed it. The bow railing, which was intact in 1985, has partially collapsed. The roof of the officers' quarters, which was clearly defined in early photographs, has caved in. The hull plating in the most heavily corroded sections is paper-thin in places, maintained in apparent solidity by the rusticles that have replaced the iron with their own structure, a hollow shell of bacterial byproducts that holds the shape of the ship even as the substance of it dissolves. When those rusticles are disturbed by the propeller wash of a submarine or by being touched, they do not break like rust. They collapse. They puff into clouds of fine orange particles that drift slowly in the water and settle on the sediment nearby. One microbiologist who examined samples from the Titanic in the 1990s identified a previously unknown species of iron-oxidizing bacteria in the rusticles, a species found nowhere else in the world's oceans that had apparently evolved specifically in the microenvironment of the Titanic's corroding hull. It was a species that had colonized the ship within years of its sinking, had adapted to the specific chemical environment of that particular steel, and had been evolving and diversifying in that environment for decades. The ship had, without anyone planning it or overseeing it, become the site of a speciation event, a place where evolution was happening, quietly, in the dark, fed by the steel of a famous ocean liner. The researchers named this newly discovered bacterial species Halomonas titanicae. It is a species that would not exist if the ship had not sunk. It is a life form that the Titanic called into being simply by being there, simply by offering the particular chemical environment of its corroding hull to an ocean that is very good at finding ways to use what it is given. The current estimates suggest that the bow section of the Titanic will be structurally unrecognizable within 20 to 40 years. The stern section, which landed more violently and is already far more collapsed and disorganized, may be unrecognizable sooner. Within a century, perhaps within two, the ship will be gone in any recognizable sense. What will remain is a chemical ghost, an area of the ocean floor where the sediment has been permanently altered by the presence of the wreck, where the bacterial communities established by the rustical ecosystem persist even after the last piece of steel has been consumed, where the trace minerals leached from the ship's hull have changed the local chemistry of the water and the sediment in ways that may persist for thousands of years. The ship will be gone, But the ocean will remember it, in its own way, in the only language the ocean knows. There is a particular beauty in the way the ocean is consuming the Titanic that deserves to be held for a moment. The grand staircase, which was one of the most celebrated features of the ship's interior, the great sweeping double staircase that connected the upper decks and was topped with an ornate dome of wrought iron and glass, no longer exists as a staircase. The wooden treads and banisters were consumed by wood-boring organisms and bacteria within a few years of the sinking. The wrought iron has corroded to the point where the original forms are no longer fully recognizable. But the space where the staircase was, the air shaft that the dome created in the ship's interior, has become a habitat. Fish swim through it. Anemones have attached themselves to the corroded ironwork. The space that was designed to impress first-class passengers traveling between decks is now used by organisms that have no conception of architecture or engineering, or the social ambitions that went into the staircase's design. The ocean has repurposed it. It has taken something that was built for human meaning and given it an entirely different kind of meaning. The meaning of an ecological niche filled, of shelter provided, of a hard surface in a world of soft sediment made available to whatever needed it. The Titanic is the most famous, but it is not alone. The ocean floor is a vast archive of human construction. The German battleship Bismarck lies at approximately 4,790 meters depth in the North Atlantic, roughly 650 kilometers west of Brest, France. It was sunk on the 27th of May, 1941, after a pursuit by the British Royal Navy that has become one of the most studied naval engagements of the Second World War. The ship was hit by multiple torpedo strikes and shell fire and eventually scuttled by its own crew to prevent capture. It sank in less than 30 minutes, taking with it approximately 2,200 of its crew of around 2,220. Robert Ballard found the Bismarck in 1989, 4 years after finding the Titanic. What he discovered surprised him. The Bismarck, despite being even larger than the Titanic, was in remarkably better condition. The hull was largely intact. The secondary gun turrets were still in position. The anchors were still in place. Ballard initially attributed this to the different conditions at the Bismarck's deeper resting place and to the different type of steel used in German warship construction, which may corrode at a different rate than British commercial steel. But later analysis revealed another factor. The Bismarck landed on the slope of an underwater volcanic mountain, and it then slid down the slope for several hundred meters before coming to rest at a tilt on a ledge. The sliding motion and the resulting impacts may have disrupted the early colonization of the hull by rustical bacteria, slowing the corrosion process. Or the specific chemical environment of that volcanic seamount may have provided conditions less favorable to the iron-oxidizing bacteria than the flat abyssal plain where the Titanic lies. We do not know for certain. The ocean keeps its own counsel. What researchers did find on the Bismarck was evidence of the same process that is consuming the Titanic, simply at a much earlier stage. The rustical formations were smaller and less developed. The hull plating was still structurally sound in most areas. The organic material within the ship, the wood paneling and carpeting, and the personal possessions of the crew was almost entirely gone, consumed by the bacteria and fungi and invertebrates that process organic material on the abyssal floor. What remained was metal, and the slow work of the bacteria had only just begun. But the Bismarck had something that the Titanic lacked in the same degree. It had become, in the decades since its sinking, a significant ecological feature in an area of the deep North Atlantic that would otherwise offer very little shelter or structure for the organisms of the deep sea. On the flat abyssal plain, the wreck stands out as a three-dimensional object in a landscape that is otherwise entirely horizontal. It creates currents, it creates shade, it creates shelter from the slow drift of deep water. And the organisms that require a hard substrate to attach to, the corals and the sponges and the anemones and the feather stars and dozens of other sessile or semi-sessile invertebrates, have found it. The decks of the Bismarck, which once carried anti-aircraft guns, and the boots of 2,000 men going about their duties in the cold North Atlantic, are now platforms for a community of cold water organisms that are as indifferent to the history of the ship they inhabit as they are to the war that put it where it lies. This is the other thing that happens to a ship on the ocean floor. It becomes a reef. The word reef in the context of the deep ocean carries a different meaning than it does when applied to the shallow tropical reefs most people are familiar with. There is no sunlight here. There are no photosynthesizing corals building their calcium carbonate skeletons toward the light. The organisms that colonize a deep-sea wreck are cold water corals, filter feeders, organisms that extract their energy not from sunlight, but from the particles of organic material that drift past them in the slow, deep currents. They are slow-growing and long-lived, capable of surviving for decades or centuries on the sparse nutrition the deep ocean provides. And they transform a wreck from a dead object into a living habitat in ways that are, once you understand the ecology, as dramatic as anything that happens on a tropical reef. Consider what a wreck offers to an organism in the deep sea. The abyssal plain, which covers the vast majority of the ocean floor, is almost perfectly flat, composed of fine sediment that offers no anchor point for organisms that need to attach to a hard surface. The few hard substrates that exist on the deep ocean floor, volcanic rocks, coral skeletons, the shells of large mollusks, are rare and widely scattered. An organism that needs a hard surface to settle on, to build its skeleton on, to begin its life on, may travel as a larva for weeks or months through the currents of the deep ocean before it finds such a surface. Or it may not find one at all. The mortality rate for larval invertebrates in the deep sea is extraordinary. The ones that do find a substrate and survive to adulthood may live for a very long time, sometimes centuries in place, filtering the water and growing slowly, and reproducing rarely, in the patient manner of organisms that have learned to treat scarcity as a permanent condition. A shipwreck is, from this perspective, a windfall. It arrives suddenly on the abyssal plain and immediately provides hundreds or thousands of square meters of hard substrate where none existed before. The steel hull, the deck fittings, the propeller shaft, the anchor chain, every solid surface is potential real estate for a colonizing organism, and the colonization begins almost immediately. Within years of a wreck reaching the ocean floor, the first sessile organisms are establishing themselves on the metal surfaces. Within decades, the wreck is hosting a community of organisms so diverse and so dense compared to the surrounding abyssal plain that it functions as a genuine oasis, a localized concentration of life in an otherwise sparse environment. The marine biologists who have studied the ecology of deep-sea wrecks have documented hundreds of species colonizing single wrecks. Cold water corals of several species, including Lophelia pertusa, which builds branching colonies of white calcium carbonate that can eventually cover large sections of hull plating. Sponges, which filter the water with such efficiency that the water passing through a large sponge is measurably cleaner than the water around it. Anemones, which extend their tentacles into the slow current to catch passing prey. Crinoids, the feather stars, which anchor themselves to the highest points of the wreck, the tips of masts and the edges of gun barrels and the peaks of navigation lights, where the current is strongest and the food particles most concentrated, and extend their arms in elaborate fans that act as living nets. Sea cucumbers, which process the sediment that accumulates in every hollow and depression on the wreck's surface. Urchins, brittle stars, chitons, polychaete worms of dozens of species, amphipods, isopods, and eventually, attracted by all of this life, the larger and more mobile inhabitants of the deep sea. Fish of various species that use the wreck as shelter or as a hunting ground. Cephalopods that lurk in the dark spaces within the hull, and in the wrecks that lie within the range of certain deep-diving, air-breathing animals. Occasional visits from seals or dolphins, or even the sperm whales that routinely dive to depths exceeding 1,000 meters in search of squid. Let yourself feel the scale of this for a moment. A ship that was built to cross the ocean, to move through the sea as efficiently as possible, to minimize its interaction with the water it traveled through, lies on the ocean floor and becomes, over the course of decades, precisely the opposite of what it was designed to be. It becomes fixed. It becomes still. It becomes the center of a community rather than a vessel passing through one. The engine that once drove it is now a habitat for organisms that have no understanding of engines. The cabins where passengers slept are now territories disputed by fish that have never seen sunlight. The dining room where people sat for meals is now a labyrinth of coral, its walls and ceiling transformed into a garden of white and pink and orange organisms that have been growing toward the center of the space for decades. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, filling it with structure the way a forest fills an empty field, one patient year at a time. The Pacific Ocean holds the largest concentration of war wrecks in the world. The battles of the Second World War in the Pacific, created in a period of 4 years. What the natural processes of the deep ocean would have taken millions of years to produce through geological means. A vast field of artificial hard substrate scattered across the abyssal plain and the shallower seas of the Western Pacific in a pattern dictated not by tectonics or volcanism, but by the routes of convoys and the positions of naval engagements and the decisions of admirals. Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands of the Western Pacific is perhaps the most extraordinary example. On the 17th and 18th of February 1944, American carrier aircraft attacked the Japanese base at Truk in a surprise operation called Operation Hailstone. In 2 days of strikes, American planes sank approximately 40 Japanese ships, including destroyers, cruisers, cargo vessels, and support ships, along with roughly 250 aircraft. The ships that sank in Truk Lagoon came to rest in water between 15 and 60 meters deep, well above the abyssal plain and within range of what is technically called the mesophotic zone, where enough sunlight penetrates to support some photosynthesis, though not enough for shallow water coral reefs to thrive in the same way they do in the brightest surface waters. What has happened to the ships of Truk Lagoon in the 80 years since they sank is one of the most dramatic ecological transformations ever documented in the ocean. The wrecks are now artificial reefs in the fullest sense of the term. Every surface of every ship is covered in coral growth, in sponges, in soft corals, in sea fans, in an exuberance of growth that has transformed the wrecks from recognizable ships into something that looks from a distance like natural reef structure. The holds of the cargo ships, which still contain the war materials they were carrying when they were sunk. Ammunition and fuel drums and aircraft engines and personal equipment have become chambers of coral, their contents slowly buried under the accretion of decades of biological growth. Schools of fish numbering in the thousands hover over every wreck. Sharks patrol the perimeter. Sea turtles navigate between the coral formations. The wrecks are now among the most biodiverse marine environments in the Western Pacific, supporting more species per unit area than many natural reefs in the region. The Japanese cargo ship Fujikawa Maru, which sits upright on the bottom of the lagoon at 33 meters depth, is perhaps the most spectacular of the Truk wrecks, its holds packed with disassembled aircraft and its exterior transformed into a magnificent artificial reef. Divers who visit it describe the experience as moving through a world that seems simultaneously military and biological, simultaneously dead and alive. Zero fighter aircraft, intended to defend the skies of the Pacific, lie in the hold beneath a ceiling of coral. The ship's telegraph, which once relayed speed commands from the bridge to the engine room, is covered in a garden of soft corals so dense that the instrument itself is barely visible. The hold where once there was only steel and aircraft and the business of war is now a nursery for juvenile fish, a feeding ground for sea turtles, a territory for moray eels that have claimed the engine room as their own. The ship has not been preserved. It has been transformed. And the transformation has produced something richer and stranger and more alive than the original object ever was. The wrecks of the Solomon Islands tell the same story in deeper water. The waters around Guadalcanal, where some of the most intense naval fighting of the Second World War took place, contain the remains of dozens of ships from both the American and Japanese navies, sunk in engagements so rapid and so violent that the area is known to naval historians as Iron Bottom Sound, a name given by American sailors after the Battle of Guadalcanal because of the extraordinary concentration of sunk ships on the ocean floor. Many of these wrecks lie at depths of several hundred meters in the upper mesopelagic zone, where the ecology is different from both the shallow tropical reefs and the deep abyssal plain. They have been colonized by organisms adapted to this intermediate depth and its particular combination of dim light and moderate pressure and cold, nutrient-rich water. The USS Atlanta, an American light cruiser sunk in the night battle of November 12 and 13, 1942, lies at approximately 140 meters depth off Guadalcanal. It was struck by both Japanese and, tragically, American shellfire during the confused night engagement, and it sank with the loss of approximately 170 crew members. Today, the ship is largely intact and is one of the most ecologically significant wrecks in the Solomon Islands. At that depth, in those conditions, it has become home to a community of deep mesophotic species, organisms adapted to life in the dim blue light that filters down from above, and it provides critical habitat for fish species that are rare or absent in the surrounding open water. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, which famously rammed and sank PT-109, the patrol torpedo boat commanded by a young John F. Kennedy, lies in the waters of the Solomon Islands as well, though its exact location was only confirmed in recent years. The ship that would make Kennedy famous enough to one day become President of the United States, and the ship that sank it, both lie in the dark water of the Pacific, both in the process of being transformed by the same slow, patient processes, both becoming habitat for the organisms of a tropical sea that is indifferent to the political history that surrounds them. The Musashi, one of the two largest battleships ever built, sister ship to the Yamato, sank during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, after being struck by approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, a volume of firepower that attests to the extraordinary difficulty of sinking a ship of that size. It was found by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's research team in 2015, lying at approximately 1,000 meters depth in the Sibuyan Sea of the Philippines. At that depth, in those conditions, the transformation of the wreck is well advanced. The metal is heavily corroded, the rustical formations are mature and extensive, and the wreck has become, in the 80 years since it sank, an ecological feature of some significance in the deep Sibuyan Sea. A hard substrate in an otherwise largely featureless deep basin, colonized by the organisms of the Filipino deep sea and incorporated into the food web of those waters. Now let your mind travel to the ship that perhaps most people think of when they imagine something lost at sea, in a context of exploration and endurance rather than war. A small wooden ship named Endurance, trapped in the ice of the Weddell Sea in Antarctica in the winter of 1915, crushed by the pressure of the sea ice as it contracted around it over a period of months, and finally swallowed by the sea on the 21st of November, 1915. The ship took Shackleton's third Antarctic expedition with it to the bottom, though not the crew, who survived through one of the most extraordinary feats of navigation and endurance in the history of polar exploration, eventually reaching safety after an open boat journey of 800 miles across the Drake Passage in a lifeboat barely 22 feet long. The Endurance was found in March of 2022 at a depth of 3,008 meters in the Weddell Sea by a search expedition using an autonomous underwater vehicle capable of operating under the ice and in the extreme conditions of the Antarctic deep. What they found exceeded every expectation. The ship was upright on the ocean floor, its wooden hull still largely intact, its name still clearly legible on the stern in raised wooden lettering, the ship's wheel in place, the crew's coat still hanging in the cabins, preserved for 106 years by the cold and the darkness of one of the most remote places on Earth. The Weddell Sea bottom, where Endurance rests, is exceptionally cold, colder even than most of the deep Atlantic, and the particular bacteria and organisms that decompose wood and consume metal may be less active there, or less abundant, or both. Whatever the reason, the ship has survived a century and change in conditions that have reduced most shipwrecks of that age to scattered fragments and sediment-covered outlines. The photographs of the Endurance's discovery are among the most extraordinary images ever taken of the deep ocean. The ship sits on the ocean floor in a stillness so complete that it is almost impossible to believe it has been there for a century. The lettering of the name is perfectly preserved. The wheel stands in place as if a helmsman might step behind it. The rigging, though draped and tangled, is still largely in position. Looking at these photographs, you feel something that goes beyond the historical. You feel the presence of the object in its new environment, the way it sits in the dark, cold water, as if it has always been there. as if this is simply what the ship became when it was done with the world above. But the discovery of the Endurance also illuminates something important about the relationship between wooden ships and the deep ocean that is different from the relationship between steel ships and the deep. The Endurance has been preserved, at least partially, by conditions specific to its location. The Weddell Sea bottom is among the coldest marine environments on Earth. The wood-boring organisms that would destroy a wooden wreck in temperate or tropical water may not function effectively, or may not even be present in such extreme cold. The bacteria that process wood may be less active. The sediment conditions may impede access to the hull. Whatever combination of factors is responsible, the result is a wooden ship that has survived intact for over a century in the deep ocean, which is, by any ecological standard, astonishing. But the Endurance will not survive forever. The same processes that have been held at bay by the Weddell Sea's extreme conditions will eventually have their way with the ship. The wood will decompose, the metal fittings will corrode, the rigging will fall. The hull will begin to collapse inward as the structural integrity of the wood is compromised over years and decades. And as it does, the Endurance will go through its own version of the ecological transformation that is happening to the Titanic and the Bismarck and the wrecks of Iron Bottom Sound, adapted to the specific conditions of the Antarctic deep, colonized by the specific organisms that live there, becoming something different from what it was in a way that reflects the particular ecology of one of the most remote and extreme marine environments on the planet. Wooden ships in the deep ocean have an ecology of their own that is entirely different from the ecology of steel wrecks, and understanding it requires understanding the organisms that specialize in processing wood in the deep sea. Wood is organic material. It is food, in the most direct sense, for the organisms of the deep sea. And among those organisms there is one group that is specifically and devastatingly adapted to eating it: the wood borers. Teredo navalis, the shipworm, is not a worm at all. It is a bivalve mollusk, a distant relative of the clam, that has evolved a body form so elongated and so specialized for drilling through wood that it looks, superficially, like a worm. Its shell, reduced to two tiny cutting valves at the head end of its body, is used to drill into wood by a combination of mechanical rasping and chemical dissolution. The organism secretes an enzyme that breaks down the cellulose in the wood, allowing it to use the structural material of the wood as food. Its body grows to fill the tunnel it creates, lined with a thin layer of calcium carbonate it secretes from glands along its mantle. A single piece of submerged wood can be completely honeycombed by Teredo within months, reduced from apparently solid timber to a fragile structure of thin walls between hundreds of parallel tunnels, each one the diameter of a pencil or larger, each one containing a living organism extracting nutrition from the wood. The history of wooden ships is to a significant extent the history of the battle against Teredo. For thousands of years, the only defense was to dry dock ships regularly and replace the infested timbers, or to sheath the hull in copper, which Teredo cannot penetrate, or to coat the wood in pitch or tar or other substances that the animals found inhospitable. The invention of iron and steel shipbuilding in the 19th century largely removed the threat of shipworms from commercial shipping, but it did not remove them from the ocean. Teredo and its relatives continue to work on every piece of wood that enters the sea, from fallen trees to dock pilings to the wooden wrecks of earlier centuries that still lie on the ocean floor. In the deep sea, the situation is somewhat different. The shipworms that are most active in shallow and coastal waters do not necessarily penetrate to great depths, and the cold and pressure of the deep ocean may limit the range and activity of the most voracious wood-boring species. But the deep ocean has its own wood processing community, organisms that have specialized for the particular challenge of consuming wood that has been delivered to an environment where almost nothing else contains so much accessible organic carbon. When researchers have placed fresh wood blocks on the abyssal plain as experimental substrates, they have been colonized by wood-boring bivalves within weeks, and by complex communities of secondary colonizers, organisms attracted by the activity of the wood borers and by the enrichment of the surrounding sediment, within months. A wooden ship on the abyssal plain is, from the perspective of the deep-sea ecosystem, something analogous to a whale fall. It is a sudden, enormous delivery of organic material to a place that rarely receives anything of the kind. The wood provides food, but it also provides structure. And the structure attracts organisms that need structure. And those organisms attract the things that eat them. And within years or decades, the wreck of a wooden ship on the deep ocean floor has become a small but complex ecosystem. An oasis in the abyssal desert, fueled by the carbon that was once a tree, that was once a ship, that was once a thing that human beings built with ambition and maintained with care, and ultimately lost to the sea. This is the point at which the comparison between a whale fall and a shipfall becomes not just metaphorical, but ecologically precise. The whale fall ecology, which we have understood in some detail for several decades now, proceeds through recognizable stages. The mobile scavenger stage, when large mobile animals strip the soft tissue from the carcass. The enrichment opportunist stage, when smaller organisms colonize the enriched sediment surrounding the bones. And finally, the sulfophilic stage, when chemosynthetic bacteria metabolize the lipids in the bones and support a community of organisms that resembles, in miniature, the communities found at hydrothermal vents. A shipfall follows a parallel but distinct sequence of stages. The organic material in the ship, the food stores, the wooden fittings, the personal possessions, the remains of passengers or crew, if any, is consumed in an early stage by the mobile scavengers and decomposers of the deep sea. Then the ship itself becomes the focus of a longer and more complex process. The metal corrodes, and the bacteria that drive the corrosion enrich the sediment with their metabolic products. The structure of the ship provides substrate for sessile organisms. The sessile organisms attract mobile organisms. And the community that develops over decades is a genuine sustained ecosystem, persistent and self-renewing, capable of surviving on the resources provided by the slow corrosion of the ship's hull and the marine snow that settles on the reef it has become. The parallel between whale falls and ship falls extends to the chemical level in a way that is genuinely startling when you encounter it for the first time. At a whale fall, the sulfophilic stage is driven by the production of hydrogen sulfide from the bacterial decomposition of lipids in the whale's bones. This sulfide supports chemosynthetic bacteria, which in turn support a community of invertebrates and fish. At a steel shipwreck, the iron-oxidizing and sulfate-reducing bacteria produce a different suite of chemical byproducts, but some of those byproducts include sulfur compounds that can support a chemosynthetic community in the sediment immediately surrounding the most heavily corroding sections of the hull. In the most heavily corroded and biologically active zones of a steel wreck, the chemistry of the sediment can begin to resemble in miniature the chemistry of a hydrothermal vent or a whale fall sulfophilic site. The organisms that colonize these zones are the same organisms, or close relatives of the same organisms, that colonize those other sulfur-rich environments. A shipwreck, in its most advanced stages of decay, can become a kind of artificial chemosynthetic habitat, a small-scale analog of the deep-sea environments that support life without sunlight. There are estimated to be more than 3 million shipwrecks on the ocean floor. 3 million. The number is impossible to fully visualize, but it represents a significant ecological feature distributed across the world's oceans, in every depth zone from the intertidal to the hadal, in every ocean basin from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Some are prehistoric wooden craft that exist now only as scattered planks and ceramic cargo pots and bronze fittings embedded in sediment, their wood long since consumed by the ocean's patient processes. Some are steel steamships from the 19th and early 20th century, their hulls at various stages of the rustical transformation. Some are warships from the Second World War. Some are supertankers from the late 20th century that ran aground or were lost in storms, their massive hulls containing fuel oil and other materials that complicate the ecology of the transformation in ways that are not fully understood. Some are pleasure craft. Some are fishing boats. Some are vessels that were deliberately sunk to create artificial reefs, a practice that has become common in coastal waters where natural reef habitat has been degraded or destroyed. All of them are in the process of becoming something other than what they were. All of them are being slowly, patiently, thoroughly transformed by the same processes. The deliberate sinking of ships to create artificial reefs is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it represents a conscious attempt to participate in a process that the ocean has been performing unconsciously for as long as ships have sunk. Marine managers and conservationists in many coastal regions have recognized that decommissioned ships, cleaned of fuel and hazardous materials, and then sunk in specific locations in shallow coastal water, can provide valuable habitat for fish and invertebrates in areas where natural reef is scarce or has been damaged. The fish populations that aggregate around an artificial wreck reef can be extraordinary. Divers who visit well-established wreck reefs report fish densities that rival natural coral reefs, and the diversity of species using a single wreck as habitat can number in the hundreds. The wreck provides shelter for juvenile fish that would not survive in open water. It provides feeding grounds for larger predators. It provides a permanent feature around which the entire local food web can orient itself. The USS Oriskany, a decommissioned American aircraft carrier sunk deliberately in the Gulf of Mexico in 2006 as an artificial reef, is one of the most striking examples of this process. The Oriskany is the largest artificial reef in the world by some measures, a ship 276 meters long, sunk in 34 meters of water off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. Within months of its sinking, divers reported the first fish aggregations forming around the hull. Within a few years, the ship was hosting populations of amberjack, grouper, red snapper, barracuda, and dozens of other species in concentrations that astonished the biologists monitoring the site. The coral growth came more slowly, but within 5 years, the upper sections of the ship were already hosting a diverse community of encrusting organisms. Today, the Oriskany is one of the most productive fishing and diving sites in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is a living demonstration of what a ship can become when it is given to the sea with intention rather than by accident. But the deliberate wreck reefs of shallow coastal waters are only a fraction of the artificial reef habitat that the ocean has accumulated over centuries of unintentional shipping losses. The 3 million wrecks scattered across the ocean floor represent, in aggregate, an enormous and mostly unstudied ecological resource. Each wreck is a unique experiment in community assembly, a test of which organisms will colonize a given type of structure in a given set of conditions. And the results of those experiments, accumulated over centuries, hold information about the resilience and adaptability of marine ecosystems that we have barely begun to read. There is one more aspect of the shipfall ecology that deserves to be considered carefully before we let the ships rest in the dark for tonight. And it is the aspect that feels most quietly significant when you sit with it long enough. The ships on the ocean floor are not just habitat. They are chemical storage. They contain within their corroding hulls and their slowly dissolving contents materials that are re-entering the ocean's chemical cycles in ways that were not intended and are not always beneficial. The fuel oil that remains in the tanks of sunken warships and tankers is the most immediately concerning of these. There are an estimated 8,000 ships sunk during the Second World War alone that are believed to still contain significant quantities of fuel oil or other petroleum products. Many of these ships are in tropical or subtropical waters, close to sensitive coral reef ecosystems, and the fuel they contain is 60, 70, 80 years old, meaning the tanks that hold it are deeply corroded and in many cases very close to failing. When those tanks do fail, the oil that enters the surrounding water can have devastating effects on the reef communities that have built themselves on the wreck's exterior. The ship that has been a reef for 80 years can become a source of pollution that damages or destroys the very ecosystem it supported. The heavy metals in ship construction, lead and mercury and zinc and cadmium, are entering the sediment and the water column around every corroding wreck, incorporated into the organisms that live there, and moving up through the food web in the process known as bioaccumulation. The paints used to protect ship hulls, many of them containing tributyl and other highly toxic anti-fouling agents, are leaching into the surrounding water as the paint degrades. The ammunition in the holds of warships, in many cases still live after decades underwater, is decomposing and releasing its chemical contents, including phosphorus compounds and heavy metals, into the deep sea environment. The ocean is receiving all of these materials from the wrecks, adding them to its own chemistry, distributing them through its own processes, and incorporating them into the organisms that live in and around the wrecks in ways that are not fully characterized and are not always benign. This is the shadow side of the shipfall ecology, the part that complicates the narrative of transformation and renewal that the rustical bacteria and the cold water corals and the fish aggregations seem to tell. The ocean does transform what it receives. It is extraordinarily good at incorporating new materials into its existing cycles, at finding organisms capable of processing almost any chemical input, at building communities around almost any source of energy or material. But it cannot transform everything without consequence. The toxins in ship hulls move through food webs and accumulate in tissues. The heavy metals change the chemistry of sediments in ways that persist for centuries. The fuel oil, when it spills, does immediate and lasting damage to the communities around a wreck that may take decades to recover. The ocean is not infinitely forgiving. It is patient, and it is extraordinarily creative. And it is capable of making use of almost anything that falls to its floor. But the 3 million wrecks it has received contain, in aggregate, an enormous quantity of materials that are not simply nutrients or substrates, but pollutants. And the slow release of those materials into the ocean's chemistry is something that the ocean's own processes must work to manage, with varying degrees of success. Over the centuries and millennia during which the wrecks are being consumed, let the weight of all of this settle for a moment. The ships in the dark, each of them a world of human intention and effort, each of them now a different kind of world, each of them being slowly and thoroughly transformed into something the person who built it never imagined it would be. The cargo in their holds, the personal possessions of their passengers and crews, the engines and the anchor chains and the navigation lights, all of it in the process of becoming something else, all of it feeding something, all of it in the patient reckoning of the deep, becoming part of the ocean floor the way that everything eventually becomes part of the ocean floor. The ships do not know what they have become. They have no awareness of the transformation they are undergoing. The Titanic does not know that Halomonas titanica exists because of it, that a new species was called into being by the chemistry of its corroding hull. The Fujikawa Maru does not know that the disassembled aircraft in its hold are now buried under decades of coral growth, that what was once a cargo of war machines is now a garden. The Endurance does not know that its name is still legible on its stern in the dark of the Weddell Sea, that the coats of the men who wore them still hang in its cabins as if waiting. The ships are simply there, in the conditions they find themselves in, being acted upon by the processes that act upon everything in the ocean, being transformed at the rate and in the manner that the local ecology and chemistry determine, without any awareness of what they were or what they are becoming. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about a shipwreck in the deep ocean. It is not a tragedy preserved. It is not a museum. It is not a monument. It is a process. It is the ocean doing what the ocean does, receiving what it receives and transforming it, incorporating it, making use of it in the particular way that the deep sea ecosystem has evolved over hundreds of millions of years, to make use of anything that falls to the floor. The Titanic will be gone, eventually, in any recognizable sense. What will remain will be a chemical memory in the sediment, and perhaps a community of organisms that persist in that location, because the enrichment the ship provided has changed the local ecology in ways that outlast the ship itself. And then, over more centuries, even that will diffuse and dissipate, and the patch of ocean floor where the Titanic rested will be indistinguishable from the abyssal plain that surrounds it, and the ocean will have completed its work. This is not a sad story. It is simply the story of how things change. The ship was iron ore before it was a ship. It was a ship before it was a wreck. It is a wreck before it is a reef. It is a reef before it becomes sediment. The ocean is transforming it through each stage, not destroying it but changing it. The way the universe changes everything, the way time changes everything. The way the second law of thermodynamics ensures that nothing stays the same, but that nothing is ever truly lost, only changed, only redistributed, only incorporated into something else that was not there before and will not be there forever. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm now. long and easy and unhurried. The ships are in the dark, doing what they do. The rustical bacteria are at work on the iron. The cold water corals are extending another fraction of a millimeter of calcium carbonate in the eternal dark. The fish are moving through the spaces between the wrecks that have been their home since before they were born, as their parents and grandparents moved through those same spaces before them. The marine snow is falling on everything, as it has fallen on everything for millions of years, settling on the corroded deck plating and on the established coral and on the sponges and the anemones, covering everything slowly in its fine, pale patience, the way sleep covers the mind, quietly and completely, until morning. The ocean has received 3 million ships. It has made something of each of them. It is still making something of each of them tonight in the dark, at the slow pace of deep water and bacterial chemistry, and the patient growth of cold water coral in conditions where patience is not a virtue, but simply the nature of existence. Nothing that was given to the sea has been wasted. Nothing that was given to the sea has truly disappeared. It has only changed, only moved, only been incorporated into the larger and longer story that the ocean has been telling since long before the first ship ever floated on its surface, and will be telling long after the last one has been consumed. The Titanic is a reef. The Bismarck is becoming one. The Endurance sits in the Weddell Sea dark, with its name still readable and its wheels still in place, waiting with the patience of deep, cold water for whatever comes next. And on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound, on the floor of Truk Lagoon, on the floor of every sea where ships have been lost in war or storm or accident or age, the ocean is quietly and thoroughly doing what it has always done. It is turning our endings into beginnings. Sleep now. The ships are in the dark, held by the ocean, being slowly and completely cared for. The rusticles are growing. The corals are growing. The fish are moving through the corridors of ships that were once moving through the water above them. The sediment is settling on everything, and the marine snow is falling, and the water is cold and still and very deep, and everything that was given to the sea is being held. Let the deep ocean hold you now in the same way, without urgency, without demand, in the patient and complete dark. Sleep. The ships are still. The ocean is still. Everything is very deep and very quiet and very far below. Before the steel ships, before the iron ships, before any of the vessels that the industrial age put on the sea, there were wooden ships. Thousands of years of wooden ships. And many of them sank, and many of them lie on the ocean floor in water that is not the abyssal deep, but the comparatively shallow water of the Mediterranean and the Aegean and the Black Sea and the coastal waters of every civilization that ever put a boat on the ocean. These ancient wrecks are a different chapter in the story of what the ocean does to what we leave behind, and they illuminate that story from a different angle, across a timescale that makes even the Titanic seem recent. The Mediterranean Sea is, among other things, an archive. For 3,000 years or more, the civilizations of the ancient world traded across it, from Egypt to Greece, to Rome, to Carthage, to the trading ports of the Levant, in wooden ships carrying cargo that represented the material foundation of those civilizations. Amphoras of wine and oil and garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans consumed in quantities that seem staggering to us now, ingots of copper and tin from the mines of Cyprus and Spain, marble sculptures intended for the temples and private houses of the wealthy, grain from Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean, shipped north in quantities that fed the populations of Rome and Athens and Alexandria. All of this cargo crossed the sea in wooden ships, and a significant fraction of those ships sank, in storms and in piracy, and in the accidents of navigation, and took their cargo to the bottom. The conditions of the Mediterranean floor have preserved some of these ancient wrecks in ways that illuminate the particular chemistry of shipwreck preservation, in ways that the deep North Atlantic does not. The Mediterranean is largely anoxic below a few hundred meters in some areas, particularly in the eastern basin, meaning that the bottom water contains very little dissolved oxygen. Without oxygen, most of the organisms that decompose organic material cannot survive. The wood-boring organisms require oxygen. Many of the bacteria that break down wood require oxygen. In the low oxygen conditions of the deep eastern Mediterranean, wooden ships have survived for centuries or even millennia, with their structural integrity largely intact. Their wooden timbers preserved by the same chemistry that preserves organic material in swamps and peat bogs and the anoxic muds of certain lake bottoms. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey in 1982, sank sometime around 1330 BCE, making it one of the oldest known shipwrecks in the world. It was a merchant vessel carrying a cargo that, when archaeologists began cataloguing it, turned out to be one of the most extraordinary assemblages of Bronze Age trade goods ever found. 10 tons of copper ingots in the shape of oxide, the standard traded form for copper in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. 1 ton of tin, probably from mines in modern-day Afghanistan or Turkey, destined to be alloyed with the copper to make bronze. Glass ingots of deep cobalt blue raw glass, not yet worked into objects but waiting to be shaped by craftsmen at the destination port. Ebony wood from Egypt, ivory from Africa or the Near East, jars of olives, pomegranates still in a storage jar, a gold chalice, a bronze statue of a Canaanite deity, a trumpet, a merchant's writing board, an Egyptian scarab that may have belonged to Nefertiti. The ship carried the material culture of the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean in its hold, and when it sank, it carried all of that culture to the bottom, where it has been preserved by the anoxic conditions of the eastern Mediterranean deep for more than 3,000 years. What the ocean does to ancient wooden ships depends, more than almost any other factor, on the chemistry of the bottom water where the ship comes to rest. In the anoxic zones, ancient ships are extraordinarily preserved, their wood intact, their cargo in place, their structure recognizable after millennia. In well-oxygenated water, the wood is consumed by teredo and bacteria, and fungi within decades or at most a few centuries, leaving only the nails and fittings and the inorganic cargo, the amphoras and the ingots and the ceramics, as evidence of the ship's presence. In between these extremes, there are conditions of partial preservation, where the lower parts of the hull may be embedded in anoxic sediment and preserved, while the upper parts, exposed to oxygenated water, are consumed. The ocean tailors its response to each wreck according to the specific conditions of the location, with results that range from complete preservation across millennia to complete consumption within decades. The Black Sea, which is even more deeply anoxic in its deeper layers than the Mediterranean, has proved to be an extraordinary repository of ancient wooden ships. The deep Black Sea, below about 150 meters, contains almost no dissolved oxygen. It is a chemically stratified sea, the result of a catastrophic influx of salt water from the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus at the end of the last ice age, around 7,500 years ago, when the rising ocean broke through what had previously been a land barrier and flooded a vast freshwater lake with salt water, in an event that may be the origin of the flood myths of multiple ancient cultures. The freshwater and saltwater layers that have existed since that event never fully mix, and the deep saltwater layer is permanently anoxic, a vast refrigerator of marine darkness in which organic material is preserved essentially indefinitely. In 2017 and 2018, researchers using remotely operated vehicles in the Black Sea discovered more than 60 ancient wooden ships in astonishing states of preservation, some of them more than 2,000 years old, lying in the deep anoxic waters at depths of over a kilometer. Ships with their masts still standing, ships with their rudders still in place, ships with amphoras still stacked in their holds, ships in conditions of preservation so complete that the researchers described the experience of seeing them on their monitors as disorienting, as if the ships had just sunk rather than lying there for centuries or millennia. One ship, from approximately the 9th century CE, was so well preserved that the carved wooden decorations on its hull were still clearly visible, still three-dimensional, still showing the craftsmanship of a carpenter who had been dead for over 1,000 years. The Black Sea Project revealed something profound about the ocean's capacity for preservation that sits alongside and in tension with everything we have said about its capacity for transformation. The ocean is not simply a destroyer of ships. It is also, under certain conditions, a preserver of extraordinary fidelity. The same water that consumes the Titanic in a century has preserved Ottoman and Byzantine and Greek and even older ships in the Black Sea for 1,000 years and more. The same ocean that dissolves iron with bacterial chemistry has kept wooden ships intact in anoxic sediment since before the Roman Empire existed. The ocean's relationship with the things it receives is not simply a relationship of consumption. It is a relationship of transformation according to conditions, of preservation where preservation is chemically possible and dissolution where dissolution is chemically inevitable, of maintaining what it receives in the form that its chemistry permits for as long as its chemistry permits it. The Vasa, the Swedish warship that sank in Stockholm Harbour in 1628 on its maiden voyage, spent 333 years on the bottom of the harbour before being raised in 1961 in one of the most remarkable marine salvage operations in history. The ship was preserved in the cold, low salinity, low oxygen water of the Stockholm harbour bottom, protected from teredo by the low salinity, which the wood-boring organisms cannot survive. When it was raised, the wooden hull was largely intact, the cannons still in the gun ports, the sailors' personal possessions still in the cabins, the carved decorations still on the hull in their original positions. It has become one of the greatest maritime archaeological discoveries ever made, and it is now on display in a purpose-built museum in Stockholm, where the conditions that preserve it, cool air, controlled humidity, careful lighting, are designed to replicate, as closely as possible, the conditions of the cold, dark harbour bottom, where it spent 3 centuries. But the preservation of the Vasa came at a cost that illustrates something important about the ocean's chemistry. The sulfate-reducing bacteria that live in anoxic marine sediments had, over 330 years, converted the sulfate in the harbour water into hydrogen sulfide, and that hydrogen sulfide had reacted with the iron in the ship's nails and fittings to form iron sulfide compounds that had penetrated deep into the wood. When the ship was raised and exposed to the oxygen of the air, those iron sulfide compounds began to oxidize. The oxidation produced sulfuric acid within the wood itself, an acid that attacks the cellulose of the timber at the molecular level, slowly weakening the wood from the inside. The process, called sulfur oxidation, is destroying the Vasa even in the controlled environment of the museum, and conservators are in a constant battle to slow and reverse it, applying chemical treatments and adjusting the atmosphere in the museum to minimize the oxidation rate. The ocean's chemistry, once it penetrates a wreck, does not stop working when the wreck is removed from the ocean. The transformation that the ocean began continues on its own terms, in its own way. The ancient wrecks of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea hold something else that the modern steel wrecks do not, or at least not in the same way. They hold human stories in an almost personal sense. The Uluburun merchant who was carrying those copper ingots and that Egyptian gold chalice, the Byzantine trader whose ship sits on the Black Sea floor with amphoras still stacked in its hold, the Ottoman captain whose vessel is preserved in the cold anoxic dark. These are people who lived thousands of years ago, and the ships they were sailing are still there. The ocean has held them, in its way, for all this time. It has not remembered their names or their faces or their plans or their fears, but it has held the ships, it has preserved the cargo, it has kept the evidence of their existence in a form that we can still, thousands of years later, go down and find. This is one of the things the ocean does with what we give it that feels most significant when you sit with it quietly enough to feel its weight. It preserves, under the right conditions, not just the physical objects, but the moment of loss. The amphoras stacked in the hold of an ancient ship in the Black Sea are stacked the way the person who stacked them left them, arranged by someone who had reasons for the arrangement, who was thinking about something when they did it, who did not know that the arrangement would be the last thing they ever did, that the next thing that would happen to those amphoras was a storm, or an error of navigation, or a pirate attack, and that they would go to the bottom of the sea and stay there, undisturbed, for 1,000 years. The ocean has held the moment of that person's last ordinary act with a fidelity that no record of their life preserved above the surface of the water has matched. The debris fields of ancient wrecks tell the story of the sinking in physical form, the distribution of cargo across the ocean floor, the pattern in which amphoras and ingots and personal possessions are scattered across the sediment, records the process by which the ship sank, the direction it was moving, the way it rolled, the sequence in which its contents spilled out. Marine archaeologists read these debris fields the way forensic investigators read a crime scene, and the stories they reconstruct, of ships caught in sudden storms, of cargo ships that burned and sank slowly enough that the crew could take to the lifeboats, of warships that sank fast and catastrophically in battle, of merchant vessels that simply ran aground on uncharted reefs and went down on a clear, calm day, are stories of specific moments frozen in the pattern of objects on the ocean floor. The ocean does not know it is preserving these stories. It is simply doing what it does with everything, applying its chemistry and its physics to whatever it receives, dissolving what is soluble and preserving what is not, redistributing elements through its cycles according to its own logic. The fact that human beings find meaning in what is preserved is a human addition to a process that is entirely indifferent to meaning. But the preservation is real, and the meaning is real, and the ocean's indifferent chemistry has, in thousands of cases across thousands of years, maintained the evidence of human lives and human loss in a form that we can still recover and read. The experience of seeing a deep-sea wreck for the first time, on the monitor of a research vessel following the feed from a remotely operated vehicle, or in the rare cases where a person descends in a submersible to see it directly, is described by almost everyone who has had it in similar terms. There is a stillness about the wrecks that is different from the stillness of the surrounding ocean, different from the stillness of the abyssal plain, different from the stillness of any other place in the deep. The wreck is still in the way that a place that was once full of movement and noise and life is still after the movement and noise and life are gone. The stillness of the Titanic is not the emptiness of the abyssal plain. It is the stillness of a place that was once crowded. The objects that remain, the shoes without feet inside them, the pots and plates and bottles that were once part of a functioning kitchen preparing meals for hundreds of people, the child's toy that was found on the ocean floor in the debris field, the windows of first-class staterooms that still frame a view of cold, dark water. These things are still not because nothing was ever there, but because everything that was there is gone. Robert Ballard, who has spent more time than perhaps any other person in history looking at deep-sea wrecks through the cameras of remotely operated vehicles, has written about this quality of stillness, about the experience of arriving at a wreck and finding it inhabited by the absence of the people who were there. He describes finding, in the debris field of the Titanic, a pair of shoes lying close together on the sediment, the shoes of a passenger who died there, preserved by the tannins in the leather while the body they enclosed was consumed long ago, and the particular quality of silence that surrounds those shoes, the silence of a person who was once wearing them and is no longer anywhere. The ocean has preserved the shoes, it has consumed the person, and the juxtaposition of what is kept and what is gone, of leather that resists the ocean's chemistry and biological tissue that yields to it, creates a stillness that is not simply physical but feels, to the human beings looking at it on the monitor of a research vessel, like something more. This is the limit of the ecological story. The ecology of shipwrecks is real, and it is fascinating, and it tells us important things about the deep ocean and about the resilience and creativity of marine life in conditions of extreme scarcity. But the ocean does not know about the shoes. It does not know that they meant something to the person who wore them, or that they mean something to the people who found them 8 decades later. It knows only chemistry. It knows only what it can dissolve and what it cannot, what it can consume and what it can preserve, what it can transform, and what it can leave in place for longer than any human life. The shoes are still there on the sediment of the North Atlantic, in the cold and the dark, 3,800 meters down. The ocean surrounds them and touches them, and is slowly, in its patient way, working on the leather. But for now they are still there, still in the position they came to rest in when the person who wore them died, and the current and the falling carried them to this particular place on the ocean floor, still keeping, in their shape and their arrangement, the memory of a person who has no other memorial in any place we can visit. The ocean holds them, not with sentiment, not with care in any sense that a person would recognize as care, but with the thoroughness of a chemistry that has been doing this kind of work for 4 billion years, and with the patience of a depth that changes nothing quickly, and with the cold that slows every process and extends every moment, so that what falls to the abyssal floor rests there, in whatever state the ocean's processes allow, for longer than the civilizations that produced it have existed or will exist. Let that be the image you carry with you as you move towards sleep. 3 million ships, each one a world, each one a moment of loss, preserved in the particular form that the chemistry and depth and temperature of its resting place allow, each one being transformed at its own pace in its own way into something the ocean can use, each one holding, in its stillness and its decay, the memory of the people who built it and sailed in it and lost it. A memory preserved not by intention or sentiment, but by the indifferent and extraordinary chemistry of the deep sea. The Titanic is rusting. The Bismarck is being covered in cold water coral, its guns pointing at nothing, its decks becoming gardens. The wrecks of Iron Bottom Sound are home to fish that have never seen the sky. The Endurance sits upright in the Weddell Sea, with its name still clear and its wheels still in place, being very slowly incorporated into the ecology of the Antarctic deep. The ancient ships of the Black Sea rest in their anoxic dark with their cargo still stacked in their holds, preserved by the same chemistry that killed them, by the deep cold water that rolls over them without urgency, without end. And on the floor of harbors and coastal seas and the deep Atlantic and the deep Pacific and every ocean in between, 3 million more wrecks lie in conditions ranging from complete preservation to complete dissolution, each of them at a different point in the same long transformation, each of them being held by the ocean. In whatever way the ocean knows how to hold things, the ocean holds everything eventually. The ships and the cargo and the people and the shoes and the toys and the names on the sterns and the bells that marked the watches and the maps that showed where the ship was going and the letters that were never delivered and the photographs that were never developed and everything else that went down with everything that ever sank. It holds them not forever, but for longer than we can fully imagine, in the cold and the dark and the pressure, in the particular stillness of a place that was made violent once and has been still ever since, in the care of organisms that do not know they are caring for anything but are doing what they have always done, which is to find what falls to the floor of the sea and make something of it. Let your body settle now, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly and completely, finding its rest in the surface beneath you. Let the sounds around you become background, the way the sounds of the ship fell silent for the last time when it reached the bottom. Let your breathing slow to the pace of the deep current, which is not a pace you can feel, but a pace you can imagine, very slow, very steady, moving through the cold, dark water without hurry, carrying with it the particles of everything that has ever fallen to the sea and been transformed, the particles of ships and creatures and bones, and all the accumulated material of everything that the ocean has ever received and processed and incorporated into itself. You are not at the bottom of the sea, but you are held right now by whatever surface supports you, with the same completeness that the ocean floor holds the ships. You do not have to do anything to be held. You only have to stop resisting it. The way the ship stopped resisting when it reached its depth, when the falling was finally over and the stillness began, when the wreck settled into the sediment and the ocean received it and the transformation began. The Titanic is still, the Bismarck is still, the Endurance is still, the 3 million ships are still, each in their own darkness, each being held. Sleep now, let the deep have you. It knows what to do. There is a category of wreck that sits apart from all the others, and it is worth visiting before we leave the ocean floor for tonight. The ghost ship. Not the ghost ships of maritime mythology, those vessels found drifting without crew in perfect condition, the Marie Celeste and its descendants in folklore and legend. The ghost ships of the deep ocean are something more literal and more strange. They are ships that have sunk in conditions of such particular chemistry and temperature that they have been preserved decade after decade in a state that is neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither fully wrecked nor fully intact, hovering in the long transition between what they were and what the ocean is slowly making of them. The SS Thistlegorm, a British armed merchant navy ship sunk in the Red Sea in 1941 by a German air attack, is perhaps the most visited wreck in the world. It lies at 30 meters depth in the Straits of Gubal, in water that is warm and clear and exceptionally rich in marine life. In the 80 years since it sank, the Thistlegorm has undergone a transformation that feels, when you see it, almost theatrical in its completeness. The holds, which still contain the cargo of military equipment the ship was carrying to the Allied forces in North Africa when it was sunk, are now corridors of coral. Motorcycles and trucks and railway locomotives and boots and weapons lie exactly where they fell when the ship sank, now draped in soft corals and encrusted with sponges, frozen in the moment of catastrophe, but covered in 80 years of biological growth. The fish are everywhere. Glassfish cloud the interior spaces in such numbers that the light inside the hold is filtered through their bodies. Lionfish patrol the corridors between the motorcycles. Barracuda hover in formation above the cargo hatches. The thistlegorm has been a reef for longer than it was a ship, and the reef has grown so dense and so diverse that the ship beneath it is, in places, visible only in outline. The architecture of a vessel glimpsed through the architecture of a coral garden that has taken it as its foundation. The ghost quality of the thistlegorm comes from the cargo. Those motorcycles, those trucks, those railway locomotives still on their flatbed trucks in the hold, their wheels slightly rusty but recognizable, surrounded by fish that have never understood what a locomotive is or was for, using the space between the wheels as shelter from the current, as territory as home. The equipment that was being